Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about how to protect the estate and respect the tenant, from the perspective of an attorney and real estate agents. So today, speaking with us is Steve Blake. He is an attorney here in San Diego with Blake Law Firm. And Steve, just a little intro about you. You are a California real estate attorney with 20 plus years of experience in real estate, business, and litigation matters, including landlord and tenant matters. So thank you, Steve. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's very exciting to be here. I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, so I'm Kim Ward. I am a real estate broker with Horizon Real Estate's Probate and Trust Help. I have been helping executors, administrators, and trustees for over 20 years with homes in probate or trust administration.
And I'm Ashlie Rivera. I've been working with Probate and Trust Help here in San Diego County for over 10 years. And I am Kim's sidekick. I'm her right-hand woman. So here I am helping out.
She's really my business partner.
Okay. So today we're going to cover some of the things that would take place during the sale of a property, or if you choose to maintain a property that's either in a trust or is going through probate, and what steps you would take if there is a tenant in the property.
I'll talk to the idea of if you're considering as the personal representative of an estate, whether you want to keep the property and continue it as a rental, or if it's a better option for the estate to prepare, market, and sell the property. And the thing is, if you have a property management company right now that has been managing the property, you're going to want to talk with them, get a copy of the lease, or if it's at a month-to-month, whatever rental agreement there is, review that and determine if you want to stay with that property management company. Or I don't recommend you take it over yourself and become the property management company yourself, because there's a lot of intricacies that Steve will share with us about that.
Sure. Yeah. So like she said, there's a lot of different decisions that need to be made. But the first thing that you would want to do is obviously understand, who are the tenants in the property? What type of a lease agreement do they have in place? If any type of lease, as you guys mentioned earlier, a lot of times the tenants might be family members or relatives, and maybe they don't even have a lease. But, under California law, they still could be considered a tenant. And so you'd have to, treat them in that fashion.
Right. And we do run into that a lot, that it's a family member or friend that has been either living in the home to keep company of or care for the decedent, and they don't have a legal agreement. So I think the thing, after you see what the lease is and what's in there, I've had experience looking at some of these leases that the rent has not increased to fair market value. And I think that's an important thing, that if you're going to keep that tenant, you're going to only be able to increase the rent a certain amount to try and get to fair market value, versus you would need to do the proper documentation to have the tenant vacate the property, so that if you're keeping it as a performing asset, that the price of the rent could go up to its fair market value. And Steve, I'm sure you can talk about how much can be increased on that fair market value.
Yeah, so there are laws in California regarding that. And also the lease agreement itself might have a provision in there that talks about, what type of increases the landlord can make. But, generally it's around 10% or less. So it's something that you'd have to look at and determine how long the tenant's been there, what type of lease they have in place, if they even have a lease in place. And as you know, if you're leasing it, or if the tenant is a family member or a relative or a friend, the chances are there may not be a lease. And then you have to determine, what type of rights the owner of the property, who's then, inherited it, what rights they have to get back possession of the property.
Right.
So maybe today, let's start out, maybe we can cover some of the immediate steps that are taken after inheriting a tenant-occupied property, some general duties to the tenant, some common challenges, and then, when you're selling the property with or without the tenant, what would take place. So some of the immediate steps to take after inheriting a tenant-occupied property. So in our experience, one of the first things you're going to want to do is review the existing lease agreement, if there is one, right? And that's just to understand the rents that are due, if there's a security deposit, any clauses in that regarding payment, adjustments to late fees, et cetera, that need to take place. And then the landlord may determine whether to set up a new bank account, or in this case, the successor in interest, which, that would be someone who is, well, I guess, Steve, why don't you speak to what a successor in interest is?
Yeah, so this slide refers to the landlord, but what we're really referring to is the person that inherited the property. They're obviously a different person than who was the previous owner, and so they're considered a successor in interest to the deceased person's estate. So they become the new landlord, whether they like it or not. They are a landlord because they're inherited a property that has a tenant in it. So that tenant historically was probably sending rent to a check made out to a certain person to a certain address, and so you need to communicate with that tenant, as it says here on this slide, to notify them, now send the rent to me at this address, make your check payable to so and so, but that will have to be communicated to the tenant. And then you'd also want to understand, what is the situation currently? Is this tenant current on rent? Do they owe a bunch of rent? Is there a security deposit being held somewhere? Where is it? It needs to be transferred to, the new owner, which is the successor in interest. So all these things are something that you're going to want to figure out, pretty quickly, so that you can figure out, is this landlord-tenant situation something that I want to step into and continue to do? And as you'll see, as we talk about a little bit later, there's a lot of pitfalls for California landlords, and there's a lot of rules that need to be followed. So it's not the easiest task to take on, but it certainly can be done. But if you're not familiar with it, it's something that you're going to want to talk to a good realtor or a good attorney and understand, what your options are.
And we always recommend having a team of both because, from your perspective, you're handling the legal side of things, but, we're kind of the boots on the ground. So we're the ones who are there communicating with that tenant and trying to, work out whatever the scenario is going to be and trying to keep them in cooperation with the whole process so that, our client doesn't have to try to manage that piece as well. That can be a lot to manage the,
it's an arm's length relationship sort of between our client who's thinking they might want to be a landlord and the actual tenant. And I've had a lot of experience of keeping people calm and giving them the information they need and guiding them, because of course when someone passes away, let's say that person they were managing the property themselves and not a property management, there could be some confusion there with the tenant of what's going to happen to them, and to just really give them all the facts so they remain calm and we just keep them informed.
Yeah, I can chat about this slide real quick. But as we've been talking about, the person who inherits the property, they're stepping into the shoes of being a landlord. And when you're making this analysis, you're going to want to evaluate whether you want to, continue to be a landlord and keep the property, or, maybe the other option is to sell the property. And, part of that decision-making process is something that Kim and Ashlie would help their clients with. And if you look at, the second bullet point, this is really a key aspect is, what is it going to cost me to keep this property and run it as a rental property? And you're going to want to look at what's the condition of the property. Is there deferred maintenance? Does the roof need to be replaced? Is there, leaks in the roof? Are there broken windows? All those things are going to be an expense. And then property taxes. And then obviously, what is the potential rental income? So, these aren't really legal issues per se. It's more of, what's the financial status of this property? So maybe you can speak about that a little bit, what you've seen.
One of the big things that people find out once they have inherited a property, let's say, for instance, their father purchased the property 40 years ago, the property taxes might be $1,000 a month. But because upon death, because of Proposition 19 that passed, I think it was 2021, that changed, which is unfortunate for people that are inheriting a piece of property, because all of a sudden, instead of $1,000 for property taxes from the date of death to either the sale, or if you keep the property, it's going to increase substantially. Mm-hmm. So if the property is an $800,000 fair market value property, the taxes are going to increase to probably $9,000 a year instead of $1,000. So that's something that helps to make the decision pretty quickly whether the numbers work out to keep the property, do repairs. We believe in cost-effective repairs, but when you're selling, but when you're renting, you have to bring that property up to a condition where someone's going to want to rent it. And some of the time that's substantial. The other thing is a capital gain situation. When you sell the property within the first year from the date of death, whatever that property sells for, this is my understanding, you can let me know if I'm correct, Steve, the property, whatever it sells for within that year, would be considered the market value of the property. And even if the date of death appraisal is less, it's still, there wouldn't be a capital gains situation, but there would be after 1 year.
That's, as far as I understand it, I'm not a CPA or a tax attorney, but there's a lot of tax considerations to take into account regarding how you want to, handle the property. Mm-hmm. So that's very important. And I think dealing with a good realtor to help you make that analysis and figure out what it's actually going to cost is key. Mm-hmm. And this last bullet point, we haven't talked about this yet, but everything we've been talking about is where one person inherits a property and now they're the landlord. But what happens when the property is passed down to more than one person? Let's say there's 4 siblings that all inherit this one property. Oftentimes, no problem, everybody gets along, they can work as a team, but more often than not, there can be problems. 2 of the people want to sell the property, 2 of the people don't want to sell the property. You can imagine 100 different scenarios where it could cause a dispute between these co-owners. And if that's the case, there's remedies that people can seek in court to try to partition the property and things along those lines. But, as an attorney, I've dealt with those types of lawsuits, and it can be time consuming and expensive for people to fight those fights. So it's a real issue when there's, several people inheriting something. And I'm sure as realtors, when you're working with a property that has multiple owners, you probably have situations where, there's conflicting interests, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So in our experience, a lot of times, like we said earlier, once everybody has all the facts, it becomes much clearer financially whether or not it makes sense to continue to rent or to sell. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it makes more sense to sell. And this is just because, taxes, capital gains, potential maintenance, the current tenant may not be paying fair market value for rent, and there is a limitation on how much you can increase. And all of these factors will help everyone make a decision. But in the case where potentially there's co-owners, sometimes we will have a client who wants to buy the property from the rest of the beneficiaries. And in those cases, we will have them go and make sure that they can finance the property because they have to buy everybody out. So they would have to find a lender and, you know, get qualified to be able to purchase that property. And, you know, that's just an additional factor that would come along with that. We have not personally had a situation where they have gone to the point of partition of a property, but if that's the case, then we figure out how we do that and work our way through it. You know, it's a step, but it definitely is a time-consuming battle to try to get into the legal side
and
of things.
expensive, right?
Yeah, and you know, the court system's not perfect, so there's risks involved, and of course, you know, the cost.
Yeah, we haven't had that because, like I said, we go and we walk through the numbers with our potential clients. We do what's called an estimated seller proceeds document where they can see all of their expenses, starting with what we believe the price would be approximately, and taking every expense before the net proceeds to the estate. And then we'll also provide them with data on rent value every time people choose to let go of the property. Yeah, and then take their portion and do something else with it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the reasons why is this next slide, the general duties to a tenant. So if you decide that you want to be a landlord and, you know, deal with the tenant, you have obligations under the law, whether or not the lease says so or not. But you have to provide a habitable premises for the tenant. And it's not black and white what that means, but generally you have to have, you know, functioning plumbing, heating, electrical systems. You don't want to have an infestation of pets or rodents. And you need to make sure that, you know, the house or the condo is safe and that there's proper ventilation, weatherproofing, working locks on the doors and windows. So as you can see, in addition to kind of just having a relationship with the tenant, collecting rent and whatnot, there's also another layer of obligations in terms of the condition of the property that it has to be in order to comply with your obligations as a landlord. So that's another thing to take into account. And I mentioned it earlier, but like maintenance and repair costs, you know, a lot of these, if you're inheriting a property that, you know, there's been a tenant in there for 25 years, it might not be in the best condition.
Exactly.
A lot of repair work that needs to get done.
Yeah, and especially if the rent hasn't been increasing as quickly as it should have, the tenants won't bother the property management company or the owner of the property to get those repairs done. So,
which sometimes means when you're stepping in, you've got a long laundry list of things that have been neglected.
Yeah, and then you know, even after you do all your maintenance repair, let's say that the condition of the property is perfect and there's nothing that you need to do and you have a tenant in there that's paying rent. So it's just, you know, plug and play. You don't have to do anything. That's not necessarily true. You still have to do things. And I can tell you as an attorney, the landlord tenant law in California changes constantly. You know, every year there's new laws, there's new requirements. And then depending on where the property is, there may be specific municipal requirements. You know, like the city of Los Angeles has a lot of restrictions for landlords and tenants, and, you know, the city of San Diego. So depending on where the property is, well, first of all, if it's in California, you've got all the state laws, but then depending on what city it is, you're going to have to review all that stuff, keep up to date on it, and make sure that you're doing everything that you're required to do as a landlord. So that's a challenge as well.
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely. Common challenge.
And speaking of that, here are the common challenges.
Yeah, we kind of already hit a lot of these points.
Well, let's hit on dealing with difficult tenants just a little bit, because let's say that there isn't a lease or any kind of contract for the person that is living in the property when your loved one passed away. Sometimes they think they can stay there indefinitely, but as a personal representative, your fiduciary duty is to manage the property and either sell it or make it a performing asset or something, that a family member can't stay in the property indefinitely.
Yeah, and that's a huge challenge in California. If you have a tenant in your property and they stop paying rent or they do something else that's in breach of the lease, they're selling drugs out of the property or they're doing something illegal, and you want to kick them out, you have to follow the law. You can't just go over to the house and throw their stuff out in the driveway and change the locks. That's prohibited. You have to follow the law, and it's complicated. It involves serving notices on the tenant and then waiting for certain time periods, and because they have the ability to cure. So, they're not paying rent, you have to give them a notice, but then they have a time period to pay. And then if they don't, and you have to take legal action to try to evict them, it's a very complicated and technical process. And it requires, filing paperwork with the court, getting a judgment, having a sheriff go out and lock them out. It's very messy, and there's a lot of pitfalls for landlords in California. The laws regarding eviction are, in my opinion, very tenant favored. So there's a lot of hoops you need to jump through, and it's not easy to get somebody out of the property that doesn't want to leave, even if they're not paying rent.
So it's much more beneficial if possible, if the opportunity arises to maintain a good relationship with the tenant in the property, whether they are a family member or an actual someone who's renting with a lease. It's always beneficial to try and maintain a good relationship, which is one of the things that we attempt to do for our clients as much as possible.
Let's touch on finding future tenants for a property that is now vacant. So you went through the scenario of giving proper notice, the tenant moved out, and now you have a vacant property you want to rent at the market value that you believe it's worth. And that's a complicated process also, putting together photos and an ad and advertising and sorting through that, taking your time to go and be at the property, to meet people that said they were going to be there and then they don't come, and it's complicated. And then making sure that once you do have someone, that you've done the background check, the credit check, all that, putting together the proper paperwork that protects you here in California, which is, like Steve was talking, it's very it's complicated paperwork. You want to make sure you do everything right, and it's a moving target from year to year.
And Kim has a lot of experience with this. She has several rental properties here in San Diego County, and so she knows the time and energy that goes into it. In fact, they just had to go through the process of finding a new tenant for one of their properties, and they had someone lined up, and they had gone through the whole process, and it was time consuming. And then that particular person decided that they didn't want to move forward, and so then they had to go back and start from the beginning again. And that happens too, where you have multiple people coming in and viewing the property, and it takes time to get someone in. So, and time is money. So that's another thing to keep in mind. You might also be facing the situation where you have a vacant property because your loved one, it was their primary residence, and now that they've passed and you are in the process of probate, you might think that getting a tenant in there temporarily while you finish probate and get everything prepped to sell the property might be a good idea. But again, all of these things require time, energy, and money. And so it's good to keep in mind that everything that we've talked to up until this point is going to affect that as well.
And think about here in San Diego, properties sell pretty quickly. And so it doesn't make sense to put someone in the property that you're then going to have to remove. And the other part is, we just recently helped with a property in Encinitas, and one of the decedent's sons were living there. And after many conversations, I convinced him that it would be best if he move out so that we could present the property as vacant. They were planning on selling the property. They had to sell the property because there were 3 beneficiaries. And he finally agreed. He didn't quite understand why he couldn't stay there, but it was just because the condition of the property with him living there was not going to be the best for the estate to sell it.
Yeah, and just from a legal perspective, if they inherit the property and there's a tenant in there, and then, at some point that tenant moves out for whatever reason, either they were evicted or they just left on their own, you have a vacant property and, there's no income coming in. So that's, a financial situation. Somebody still has to pay the insurance, the property taxes, the utilities, but then also you have an obligation as a landlord to secure that property, make sure that there's no vandalism, make sure that, there's no squatters coming into the house. So you need to be monitoring that property. You can't, just let it sit there without somebody checking on it periodically.
With that, one of the things that we've helped several clients with is we will help them to get the locks changed if we know that there has been anyone in the property or in and out of the property since it became vacant. And if there's additional concern, we actually have a temporary alarm system company that we've worked with here in San Diego County, and they will come in and install an alarm system for, I believe it's like $100.
I think it's $200 now to actually install it, and then about $50 a month. So it's very cost effective to meet that obligation of securing the property. Well, just to touch on a little bit more about selling with a tenant in place. And if you want to have a vacant property that you can sell and you want the tenant to move, there's a monetary incentive that happens on occasion, because it is going to cost the tenant, an expense to relocate all their personal property and move. And, what we do, if the tenant is in place, there has been times where there's someone there, is we make sure that they plan to move 5 days before the property closes escrow, because the last thing we want is for it to be the day of closing and completing the sale and the person's still there. It would not be the best thing for the estate to not have the tenant move prior, so that there isn't that complication of someone living in a house that's about to be someone else's.
So in your experience, buyers are generally willing to pay more for a vacant property than for a property with a tenant in it.
Yes, in the situation where there is a tenant that comes along with the property, it's pretty much going to be investors, and investors are investors, and they're there to make an additional amount of money on top of the property. It's rare that an investor is going to purchase the property and keep the tenant in place, because like we talked about earlier, a lot of the time the monthly rent amount is not what it could be if you had a new tenant.
And there are some other factors that can play into why you would potentially get more for a property that is empty, doesn't have a tenant living there. And that could be the amount of times that are available for showings. You have a limited number of buyers coming in. You might have, maybe the property isn't as clean, or there is a lot of items that make the property feel less spacious than if a property is vacant and empty. These are all things that could affect the value of the home. We don't think about them necessarily when we go through the process of preparing a property, but having too many personal items in the home, having a dirty home, having a poorly maintained home. When we come in to a property that's vacant, we can make some minor changes and do some soft staging that present a home better than if a property has someone living there and may not be in that kind of condition. So
I was thinking about a property that I helped sell 3 units in Pacific Beach. And when I went into one of the units, the bed was unmade. The sink was full of dishes. The bathroom was quite dirty. And what did I do? I made the bed. I put the dishes in a box and hid them, And that's what we mean about sometimes it's not great when there's tenants in place that,
Yeah, and I agree with you from a legal perspective. It is a much cleaner transaction on the purchase and sale when there is no tenant in place. And if a buyer would ask me, well, hey, there's a tenant in place right now, but their lease expires in, 4 months. So they're going to be out in 4 months. I'm not worried about it. I'm going to buy the property anyway. I would let them know that, I understand, but just so you know, if the tenant changes his mind and doesn't want to leave, you might not be able to get them out of there as easily as you think. And I've seen a lot of landlord tenant eviction cases in my career, and there's a lot of different strategies tenants can use to make things more difficult for a landlord to get them out. There's always, the possibility a tenant files for bankruptcy or something along those lines, and then you're, dealing with the bankruptcy court. So ideally, I think if you're going to sell it, it's best to get the tenant out. And sometimes we haven't really talked about it yet, but there's cash for keys arrangements that are sometimes made. If a tenant is looking, maybe on the fence about moving out, but you offer them some cash or a month of free rent, they may take that. And if that's the case, it's one of those things where just make sure that whatever you do is in writing, and that there's some cash for keys requirements under California law about what has to be paid. So make sure that you're maybe talking to an attorney, if you're going to go that route. And I've seen situations where the tenants have refused to take cash, even when the offer is very generous. They just don't want to leave. So you never know. But yeah, that's another thing to consider.
Right. And on that subject, we defer to you to draft up that document and handle that part of it. And then as far as being available for when the tenants are moving out and handing them the check, if our client is not in this area and they don't want to have to come to San Diego, we can do that. We've been there. We schedule the locksmith and we're ready, and we hand them they hand us the keys, we hand them the check, we get the locks changed, and everything is as it should be.
Yeah, that's the way I would recommend doing it. You don't want to just do it over the phone and say, "Oh, send me the keys and we'll send you the check," because then, again, there could be a problem. And tenants change their mind all the time.
Yeah.
So, you got to be careful.
Well, and it's not easy sometimes to find a replacement property, and that's what can cause more of the problem too.
Yeah, especially if it's a family member who's been living in the property for, a limited amount of money or sometimes no money. They may not have the financial means to get out of the home and get into a new place, especially places like San Diego County, where, we have relatively high rental costs. So providing cash for keys can give them the financial means to vacate.
Well, I think we kind of talked about a lot of these things already.
Yeah.
But yeah, it looks like
well, why don't you talk to, when you can legally, what the timeline is for that.
So looking at this slide, eviction considerations when selling, these are just a few things. Like if the intent is to get the tenant out of the property before you sell it, they either have to leave voluntarily, there's some cash for keys arrangement, or they just decide they want to leave. But if they don't, and you need to evict them, then the process, as I mentioned earlier, it's complicated. But I usually tell clients, for a residential eviction, it can take anywhere from about 30 days to 90 days. If things go smoothly and there's no bankruptcies filed or anything like that. So it takes a while, and you have to commence your eviction with serving a notice, which is why we have the notice requirements in here. And it depends on what the situation is as to what type of notice you have to serve. If it's something where they're not paying rent, it's typically a 3-day notice that they have to pay or quit. If their lease just expired and they're a month-to-month tenant, you can sometimes give them just a notice to vacate, but it has to be, potentially 60 days, or if they've been there, longer than a year. So all these different notices have different timelines, and you need to serve that as the first step. And then once the notice expires, then you can move forward with your eviction, assuming numerous other, requirements are met. But it's not easy and it's time consuming. And if the tenant hires a lawyer and it's a good lawyer and they know what they're doing, they can, strategize to really make the case complicated and extend the time. And, meanwhile, you have this tenant in the property that's maybe not paying any rent. So, they get to enjoy the use of this property for free. And, you might get an order evicting them and it takes you, 3-4 months to do it. Great, you got the property back, but you're out all that money, and it's going to cost you more money to go chase that tenant around town to try to get paid. And they may not have any money. So, this is worst case scenario if you have a horrible tenant, but, most of the time your tenant's going to probably be a reasonable person and willing to talk to you. And that's why it's so important with like Kim and Ashlie to go in there early on and, meet the tenant, understand what their desires are, what their intent is. Maybe they want to leave and they're anxious to get out of there. They just haven't had a chance.
Yeah, yeah. And, going back to the cash for keys things that we were just talking about, a lot of times we found that family members that are living in the property, they want their inheritance just as much as everyone else does. And the only way they're going to get that is if the property is sold. And so they are willing to participate and to, help us get through the process. It's just sometimes they need a financial boost
Incentive.
to get them, yes, to get them to be able to find a place to move to.
Right.
That's the end, guys.
Okay.
Steve, thank you so much. You've done an excellent job.
Well, thank you, Kim and Ashlie, for letting me be a part of this today. The law regarding landlords and tenants is very complicated, and there's a lot of pitfalls. So if you do inherit a property and you want to be a landlord because you have a tenant there, or you don't want to be a landlord and you need to get a tenant out, I would suggest talking to an attorney. They're, familiar with the law, and they can advise you of your rights and your obligations under the law. So, again, my name is Steve Blake, and there's more information about myself and my firm on our website, which is on the last slide. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. It's always good to get this information out and to get your side of things and what your part is that, we have a little experience with, but we're not you. And we just love to be able to provide people with accurate information.
Yeah.
Well, you are on the side of the transaction where you're making people very happy. You're helping sell their home. They're getting money. They're, happy people, where I'm on the side where I'm dealing with the problems and the people that, things didn't work out. So it's good for us to talk because we see both sides of it, and it benefits our clients to be able to share that perspective.
Yeah. And I appreciate that, because I like to think of myself as a problem avoider. And always kind of thinking a little bit ahead of, wait a minute, they said this.
Yeah.
How do we avoid that?
Yeah. But the reality is many of our clients, they need legal representation and a real estate agent to help get them through this process because it's complicated. It's not an easy process to attempt to do yourself. And we don't recommend it. We always recommend that you have an experienced attorney like Steve Blake to help you through this process.